Good evening. Thank you for coming out this evening for this event. I want to first, I don't know if apologize is the right word, but just acknowledge that some of you have heard this before, at least aspects of it. And I recognize that. I'm going to talk about a lot of the same things we have discussed before in similar settings. I also want to take a moment to just adjust your expectations, make sure that we're on the same track. This is not a comprehensive history of the Anabaptist Christian schools. It's not like from beginning to end or anything like that. Rather, I have focused primarily in the last several years on people that paid a dear price for the privilege of Christian education. And I want to tell their stories. That's the objective. And the reason... Let's see if I can get this thing going. The reason I have Christian Light up here is because Christian Light sponsored me in making some trips and doing a lot of interviews and research time on this thing. It was all, admittedly, in the interest of writing a book, with compiling these stories and putting them in book form. And but to my dismay, they asked me to do a lot of other things at the same time I was assuming that I could do this. So the book is not yet developing very well. It is on a shelf, so to speak, and shelves shouldn't really exist in that way. But I have been quite occupied in telling these stories. And my objective in telling the stories, the suffering history of Anabaptist Christian schools, my objective is to show, number one, to show God's strong hand. So when God's strong hand, when God's people obey him in faith and obedience, his hand is stretched out in strength toward his people. I'd like to also show us and talk to us about the wisdom of respectful appeal versus resistance. Now, we have said many times that we are non-resistant people, and I'd like to show the folly of resistance and to show what the value of non-resistance is, as well as respectful appeal for authority or to authorities. Number three, I'd like to emphasize that it wasn't cheap. The price that was paid was costly. It didn't come easy, and we need to appreciate the sacrifices that were made to bring us the privilege of Christian education. And then I would like to give honor to whom honor is due. Several of the men that I will talk about this evening, they needed to be raised up from the dust of obscurity, and they need to be their stories need to be told. They need to be honored for the sacrifices that they made on our behalf and behalf of Christian education across our country, Anabaptist Christian education in particular. So I'd like to finish in time that I will open it up for questions as well. So we'll start with Virginia, is where we happen to live, of course. I'm not going to talk much about anything that happened in Virginia, just to point you to this book that was written by E. Daniel Burkholder in 2006. This is a history of the legal challenges and school struggles of the Order Mennonites in Rockingham County. Conscience in the courtroom. And I think it's just pretty neat that this congregation or this community has the distinction also of having the first and only Amish high school. That's just really neat. I think that you could. We don't want to build a shrine to this community or anything like that for that reason, but that is a unique combination that has not been duplicated anywhere else that I know of. Amish and high school just typically don't go together. So. In Minnesota, we will go to where John Koblenz was administrator of a school. I think he was 24 or 25, mid-20s at least, when he was administrator principal of a school. And the school was brought to court by the state of Minnesota, and in an account of two sets of parents, Sonja and James Watt, and Amos and Rebecca Lehman. And basically the issue here was they did not have certified teachers. And the county superintendent just kind of abstractly or just pulled their name out of a hat pretty much and just said, we're going to target this school on account of these two parents. And John and the constituents of the school and the community there and the little church community there in Minnesota decided that their first appearance in court will simply be without legal representation, and we will just be there to say what we're doing and to just simply say what we're doing. And that's the way they did. John, in his quiet manner, was called up to the witness stand. He was nervous, he says, quite nervous, but he sat there and he just simply explained what they are doing as a school. The judge was sympathetic. It was just a judge trial and not a jury trial. The judge was quite sympathetic to their cause and eventually ruled in their favor. And these are some excerpts of some of the things that the judge said concerning the church people there in Minnesota. They are sincere in their religious assertions and beliefs, and their religion pervades their entire social fabric. And he says that we should defend the exercise of their constitutional freedoms as though they were our own, because in fact they are. You see the testimony that the community was leaving with them, not because they pushed for their rights, not because they had legal representation and were arguing and resisting against the law, but simply because they chose the route of non-resistance. They were there to just simply say what they're doing and why. What is their compulsion in doing what they're doing? And the judge was very sympathetic toward them. John sought out the judge later to tell him thank you for ruling this way and for his sympathies on their part. And the judge said, it's just my job. In Ohio, in 1921 already, there were some issues with Ohio's Bing Act. Older Amish resisted this new law because they believed children only need basic scholastic knowledge and should learn their values and morals at home. The Bing Act was essentially, you have to go to school till you're 18. That was quite progressive thinking for that day and age. And several Amish parents kept their older children out of school, prompting arrests, fines, and jail sentences. And in January 1922, 5 Amish fathers were arrested for disregarding the Bing Act by keeping their teenagers at home. Now, I'm not here so much to defend everybody's point of view. You know, like they say, you know, they were right. They were just absolutely right. But rather to tell their story. So we may have some quibbles with some of the things that some of these people actually put their stakes down and dug their heels in for. But you have to admire their stand for their convictions. This was then in 1958 also. There was some, I think there was, I can't really read this, and I don't have a copy up here either, but I think they spent 12 days in jail. Some fathers and mothers spent 12 days in jail for refusing to send their upper grade children to public high schools. In Pennsylvania, too, here are some fathers walking into the jail for refusing to comply with the state's compulsory attendance laws by sending their children to public school. In Morgantown, Pennsylvania, here is a picture of Amish fathers awaiting the constable to take them to jail. They served 5 days here for violating the state's compulsory attendance laws by refusing to send their children to the public school. So you can see there's been a smattering of these kind of things all over, and I'm not I'm not nearly covering all the stories that I received, and I'm just basically telling you facts here like an encyclopedia entry here. But now we want to move into a little bit of a different direction and actually tell some stories. And we're moving now to Iowa, to the Kelowna area. And I had the privilege of spending time with Brother Glenn Bender in Auburn, Nebraska in 2020. And one comment he made stuck out to me. He said, we should not be careless or indifferent about this privilege that we have. He could say that authoritatively because of what he invested in this privilege. So back in 1965, without telling this whole story again, you can see here where the schools were attempting to consolidate. The public schools were attempting to consolidate, and they sent school buses out to pick up the Amish children whom, so far in Buchanan County, Iowa, this is where this took place. In Buchanan County, Iowa, there was just general resistance toward the authorities. And also, as we say things here this evening, I'm not attempting to throw dirt or dig dirt onto people and cast out show a lot of negative things like that. I do want to illustrate and contrast the different approaches that people took in the ways in dealing with authorities. So if something appears negative, let's not run with that and be just let's not triumph in their negativity or in their problems that they had. Okay, this was in Buchanan County, Iowa, in 1965. The buses had come out. You probably heard the story. Many stories and versions of the story are available. The buses had come out to take the children from the Amish one-room schools out in the county into the city. And the Amish resisted several times, and the whole process was just one of resistance to authorities rather than dialogue with them. And it came to the point where the buses showed up, the authorities were there, state troopers and police and sheriff deputies were there. And Aiden Yutzi, a father of one of these children in school there, when they came out of the door to load up onto the school bus, he said, "Springe for the Welschenfeld," run for the cornfield, and that's what they did. And here's my only picture I was able to find of Aiden Yutzi. He later moved from Buchanan County, Iowa to New Glarus, Wisconsin, and became a co-defendant in Wisconsin versus Yoder also. So here was a man that was kind of a center of the controversy in Buchanan County, Iowa, moved then to New Glarus, Wisconsin, ended up becoming a co-defendant in that Yoder versus Wisconsin case. I had the privilege of speaking with his widow. That's a picture there by the mailbox. And I asked her one key question among many others. I asked her, why Aiden? Why was Aiden chosen for this conflict in Buchanan County and then also again in Wisconsin versus Yoder? And people that knew Jonas Yoder, who is the first named in Yoder versus Wisconsin, know that he was a very quiet man, kind of a stubborn man, but very quiet. And it's just interesting that he's named first because he was not the spokesperson. He was not the vocal person. That vocal person in the trio here was Aiden Yutzi. And so I asked his widow, I said, why Aiden in both cases, in Buchanan County, Iowa, and then in Yoder versus Wisconsin? She said simply this: Aiden was really good with words. And so that's why I think that the Lord just orchestrated and used his skills and his abilities to make a difference here. So now we're moving beyond 1965 when this occurred, and I'm needing to tell you a few things about Buchanan County, Iowa at that time. They, already back in 1948, had their own schools, but they started with a public system in 1961. They actually accepted being brought into the public system in 1961, accepting public funds and had English teachers in their school. And then they had a history of conflict ever since that point. Ever since that point, they had a history of conflict with the state ever since they started accepting public funds and went back with the public system in 1961. When consolidation attempted in their community, they generally resisted it. And they actually made a deal. Their superintendent of education in Buchanan County actually made a deal with the Amish leaders to accept their offer that if you vote for me, if you vote for this superintendent, then I will ensure that your schools will not have to move. You can maintain your one-room schools. That's essentially what it was. It was more complicated than that, and it took a while for the Amish to be persuaded, but they did. They had 44 votes, 44 Amish votes in that election. And here is what happened as a result. In Hazleton, the vote was much closer. 264 were for reorganization. All the other districts had voted against it. 264 in Hazleton district were for it, while 215 were opposed. It was obvious that the 44 Amish men who had voted in the Hazleton district had cast the decisive ballots. Those Hazletonians who had opposed reorganization were furious about the behind-the-scenes compact and the role of the Amish in the referendum. Their witness went down the tube, just like that. The public was furious with the Amish for casting those deciding votes. But that didn't solve much anyway, because the superintendent died before he was able to carry out his promise. The next superintendent was appealed to. The Amish appealed to him and said, "We had this deal." He said, "It wasn't my deal." And the conflicts continued right on. Some of the reasons for the conflict was because of their reputation, their young people's reputation in the community. It was not a good witness. They were wild and unruly. They were lawbreakers. There was a number of things said about them. But then the state, of course, has a compelling interest in the education of its citizens. They want to be sure that every citizen has a right and opportunity for good education. And they began to see that the Buchanan County Amish were not delivering a good education for their children. The achievement tests that they were forced to take in their school showed dismal results. It was awful. And the state, of course, just tightened up the clamps and said, we're going to have to do something about this. And more stiff arming occurred, more resistance, and eventually there was a lot of fines, jailings, and in general, stiff arming the officials. The officials were complaining and frustrated with the Amish leaders. They said they won't talk. They just hide when we come around, and they refuse to enter into dialogue. It was just generally resistance. And this fed all the way up to the state capitol. The legislators there, everybody knew about Buchanan County, Iowa. Now, in the back of their minds, they remembered this Spring at Foot of Elschkenfeld thing. They remembered that. And so it was like they had public sympathy on one hand. On the other hand, they knew that their children were not getting a good education. And they had a terrible reputation besides that as well. So what should they be doing? So their crops were taken to pay their fines, which they refused to pay because that would be admitting guilt. So they refused to pay their fines, and sympathetic English people, local people, paid some of their fines for them. So this went on for a number of years. Over in Kelowna, in the Kelowna area, They had also started, the Amish there had also started with their own schools at the same time that the Beachy Amish were also starting schools in cooperation with them. They had a wary eye to Buchanan County. Now, the Kelowna Amish and the Buchanan County Amish were not pulpit sharers. They did not share pulpits at all. The Kelowna Amish had tractors, and the Buchanan County had horses only, and there was just a different stripes, and they were not pulpit friendly with each other at all. But what the Kelowna Amish did was entirely different than what the Buchanan County Amish did. The Kelowna Amish, realizing that they would be called into question as well, because by this time the State Board of Education, or let me see what it's called here. The State Board of Public Education had already voted against giving the Amish the privilege of having their own schools, 5-4. Narrow margin. They had voted, just barely made it happen so that they would not have their own schools. And then the Kelowna Amish realized all this had been happening, and they had started building a school already. They had one school functioning, and another school was they had laid the foundation for it, but they weren't sure if they were actually going to be able to occupy it. So they continued with the building, but they also organized a committee. And Glenn Bender, 27-year-old Amish bishop, was a member of that committee, the Education Committee. They made many trips to visit legislators and go to Des Moines to visit with legislators and meet with the governor. And they met with the State Board of Public Education. Now, one of the members of the State Board of Education, her name was Mrs. Cole. She was a chain smoker. She was blowing smoke in these Amish men's faces as they were sitting across the table from her, blowing smoke at them just in total disdain of anything that was Amish. She was just totally against the idea. And she was verbal about it, and just really refused to even think about giving them any special privileges at all. Glenn called her a blue-eyed, blonde-haired volcano. As she would rail against the Amish, as she would rail against what's happening in Buchanan County, and therefore we can't do anything with these people, T.J. Miller, one of the members of the committee, a wealthy Amish businessman, he was sitting very close to her, and he would just, in his kind and very gentle way, just kind of chuckle under his breath. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. And just a pleasant way of coming across. And so it was like they were answering their persecutors in a very gentle and kind way. Glenn also spoke respectful words to her. He said, he made a point to go tell her after that meeting, he made a point to go up and shake her hand and tell her, thank you for being honest with your feelings. We know how you feel, and we have no quibbles with it. We know exactly how you feel. Eventually, the legislators and the State Board of Public Education began to realize there are differences between these Amish groups. There are differences here. And one of the reasons that they began to see that is because, one thing that happened as a result of them seeing that was that the State Board of Public Education officials actually asked the Kelowna Amish Committee to go up to Buchanan County to see if they can do something with the Buchanan County Amish up there. And they hesitated long, but they went. They went, and they actually talked with the Buchanan County Amish and appealed to them to work in a different way. In one of the meetings with the State Board of Public Education, the 9-member board, they made a point of witnessing to them about their role in government. And Glenn Bender was chosen to tell them these things like this. He said, Romans 13 says that you people are God's agents to us for good. Because of government, we can rest easy at night. You do not bear your sword in vain. We respect you. We owe you respect and obedience as far as we conscientiously can. We appreciate and respect that you're God's agents placed in your time and place at this time. And we can better do that, however, if you would allow us to have our own schools. We can respect you better if you would allow us to have your own schools. The next thing they did is Governor Ray, T.J. Miller invited Governor Ray to come to Kelowna. And he did. An entourage of up to 150 people showed up in the Kelowna community to visit the schools. Education officials, legislators, the government, the state troopers, and the whole big group arrived there. They visited the 2 schools that were in operation. They had by this time taken the Iowa Test of Basic Skills and proved that they are getting as good an education, and in some cases even better education, than the state schools are. And when they visited the one school, the teacher that had been there the longest, she sang for them, she and her students sang for them the President's Song to the tune of Yankee Doodle. Glenn Bender had never heard this before, and he said it was just tremendous because they were able to go all the way from George Washington to at that time, was it Lyndon Johnson or one of those like that? They were able to sing all the presidents in order up through that time. Prior to this time, too, Glenn Bender, Brother Glenn felt like it would be nice if he would just ask the State Board of Public Education a few questions. He asked them, if any of you know the preamble to the Constitution? And not one of them did. And Glenn said, could I recite it for you? And he did. He just recited the whole preamble to the Constitution right there to all those state board officials. And just to demonstrate, we're not dumb people. We're not uneducated. We are able to engage and interact with confidence like that. 3 men on the committee also took the GED test. And most of them showed high enough results that they could have been in college, several years perhaps. After Governor Ray's visit to Kelowna, where they visited schools, they visited the farms, they had a big Amish meal for all of them. After that, Governor Ray told them that their witness is impeccable. He questioned about where they've come from. What is your history in this land of ours? And they told him all about their beginnings, all about Anabaptist beginnings in Europe and how they came over here seeking the privilege of religious freedom. And then he pledged to them his unwavering support. He said, I personally will do everything I can do to give you folks the privilege of educating your children in your schools. And he used his power and his authority to make a big difference in the direction of things from there on. The next time that this committee met with the State Board of Public Education, the vote passed 6-3 in their favor. And it was on the urging of Mrs. Cole that they all changed their mind. That 3 of them changed their mind and passed the legislation. Yeah, so here we have a beautiful example of just gentle appeal, respectful appeal, winning the day. And by the way, up in Buchanan County, their history was fraught with jailings and fines and all kinds of just bad things going on in this regard. No one in Kelowna was ever fined or jailed, although admittedly they were not called into question or were in the limelight for nearly as long. But no fines or anything for the Kelowna Amish. Here's some photos of Governor Ray with the Amish people. Some of these photos are not great because they're newspaper clippings that were copied several times. This is Glenn Bender here. I can't, it doesn't work, but he's the one with the hand across his mouth like this. He says he's embarrassed by that every time he sees that. By the way, Brother Glenn passed away about a little over a year ago, I think. So I was grateful for the privilege of interacting with him before that. Okay, we go now to Nebraska. And here we contacted Dave Berkey and Wayne Troyer. And we had the privilege of sitting with these two brothers and their wives for a good part of a day and hearing their story and reading their documents. And they gave us boxes of documents that I was able to copy and return to them, most of them at least. But the setting here is in mid-1970s. There was a groundswell of appreciation for religion, with Jimmy Carter being elected on the premise that he is a born-again Christian. That's one of the things that Jimmy Carter was part of his platform, is being born again. Along with that came a tide of Christian education incentives or new ventures. And one of those was, several of those were Alpha Omega Publishers, Accelerated Christian Education, ACE, and then following close on the heels of that was Christian Light Education eventually. But this was before Christian Light was very available at all. And the state of Nebraska was not friendly. The legislation was not friendly toward private schools or Christian schools at all. And there was no provision made for them at all. The Attorney General particularly was very, very hard on this whole thing. And there were schools springing up all over. One of those schools was an independent Baptist school run by Reverend Everett Sullivan. And then this started making a lot of headlines because of the resistance that Everett Sullivan had that he was making there. And you can see what it says here, the fiercely independent. That's one of the ways the newspaper represented him. And he ended up, though, being able to rally a lot of support for his cause. And newspapers, and there's newspaper clippings from all over the United States. And almost every major newspaper, you can find clippings about some of these events there in Nebraska in that day. And Armageddon was near. The battle lines were drawn. And these people were mostly fundamentalist background, and they were insisting on their rights. You can't mess with us. We are a church. That we believe in separation of church and state. This is our rights, and we will stand for this regardless. Here is a letter from for Elizabeth Dole, the first Secretary of Education in Ronald Reagan's White House. And Ronald Reagan was apparently planning to visit Lincoln, Nebraska on behalf of Governor Thone, who was also of his same party. And they were sympathetic. Governor Thone was generally sympathetic to the cause, to Reverend Everett Sullivan's cause. Reverend Sullivan was already in jail. The state had come in and actually padlocked the church's doors and had dragged the people out of the church, and it just made big headlines all over. But here it says, in this paper here, it says the president is headed into a hornet's nest on Wednesday when he is scheduled to speak in Lincoln, Nebraska. And a few other things says here, there will probably be more than 1,000 pastors from all around the country in the area demonstrating support for Everett Sullivan. And Dr. Bob Billings, who was a 1980 Reagan campaign liaison to the religious community, describes the situation as a powder keg. He says the preachers involved don't cuss, but wish they could. He also had reported from Chuck O'Malley that some outraged locals are talking about firearms. And there were actually vehicles confiscated, from which weapons were confiscated that were en route to this event. So this is how serious this was happening. In Beaver Crossing, Nebraska, something else was happening, and that was a small school was just beginning. This was Faith Christian School. And brethren got together and studied long and hard about this. And they felt like they will try to do legally as much as possible in starting their school. When it was discovered, however, that they could not legally start a school, they weighed the depth of their convictions and decided to move ahead with it after all. This is the handbook, in their handbook for the school that they wrote up. It's great information. They had a vision. These men were driving at something instead of running away from something. They were specifying what they wanted rather than what they didn't want. They were moving ahead with vision. They studied long. These are some of the notes of some of these people, some of their notes and some of the things that they were discovering, and they, with united purpose, decided to move ahead with this. I have some of this written down. I'll be reading some here and there. The school building was built in 1926 and was purchased in April 1977. Faith Christian School was established as a nonprofit 501c3 entity soon afterwards. David Berkey, 24. I want you to remember that. 24 years old, was asked to be the administrator of the school. His bishop was not at all favorable to the idea and did not support his role in starting the school against state law. This is one reason David and his family left the church and went to Faith Christian Fellowship, which was started by disaffected members of the two Mennonite churches in the area. When the local superintendent came to inspect the school, he commented on the happy students and seemed personally not to have a problem with the school operating. But when his report went to the state, the Attorney General joined forces with all the others to begin to prosecute the truant students. At first, the court prosecuted the school because of uncertified teachers and administrators. The two teachers were advised to pack their bags because they could land in jail that night. It didn't happen. Then the issue was basically neutered in the courts because of the positive achievement test results of the students, and the state moved on to charge and focus on truancy and then parental neglect. Okay, so because of the fine achievement test results that they had received, they had already gone through one cycle and one term, and they had achievement test results to prove that they were really doing well. And so the issue of the teacher certified or not doesn't matter if the results are there regardless. So now they're charged with parental neglect because they were not in a school that was recognized by the government. The deputy sheriff delivered the subpoena to David during the summer while he was driving tractor planting sorghum. He expressed regret at having to do so. In forthcoming days, many people, locally and nationally, expressed support for Faith Christian School. The case appeared in newspaper headlines all over. And then Dr. David Gibbs with the Christian Law Association volunteered to help them in the legal situation there, to take over the case. And they asked then if they could bring it along, although they had been involved in many of the other cases across the state. They asked if they could bring Faith Christian School to the forefront. Presumably because all the others were so belligerent, because they were so demanding on their rights. This felt different to them, and they wanted to bring this to the forefront, and they did. But they were stunned to be told by the Mennonites that they would not countersue or demand their rights, but would go the way of non-resistance and respectful appeal. Christian Law Association almost left the case, but in the end decided to assist anyway. The first thing the parents and church people did was go to the Capitol and meet with the legislators, a large group. Here's where they were charged with truancy. A large group went and walked throughout the Capitol and talked with legislators, in part to let them know that they're not going to behave like the militant fundamentalist groups. All the parents were charged with truancy and then neglect, but only Wayne Troyer and 3 of his truant children were brought to trial. This was a time of much tension and of many prayers. They gathered together often and regularly to pray about this situation. Before the first hearing, the court appointed guardians. This would be like guardians ad litem to the children who attended Faith Christian School. Legal advisors instructed parents to be prepared in case of emergency to flee with the children in case the state came to take them. A wary eye was kept on the windows and doors of the school, but they kept on. They were encouraged to lock the doors, and the local sheriff drove around the building several times one day. David describes how he went from window to window to window to window, watching the sheriff drive around the building, see what was going to happen. A lot of tension. The attorneys with Christian Law Association judged that there would be no legal recourse available and were advised to seek, that the people were advised to seek legislative relief. There was going to be no relief through the courts, but there could possibly be legislative relief if they can get it done in time. So their strategy was to bring it up over and over again and ask for continuance of the case. And that's what they did, and effectively postponed the trial until after legislation was passed. Where did David Berkey belong in all of this? David was asked by Christian Law Association to work with them in the legislative process. Consequently, David made many visits to state offices and the Capitol. He worked many hours. He estimates perhaps 1,000 hours building relationships, working with government officials, legislators, lobbyists, pastor committees, school administrators, education officials, and with Gibbs and Cray's lawyers to help draft bills that would potentially pass the Assembly's vote. Many of his meetings were held early in the morning in the Capitol or at other private venues in an effort to avoid public and media scrutiny. He faced much opposition, but in several cases, enemies were turned into friends because of his respectful and non-resistant stance. Time after time, the vote looked favorable, but at the last minute, it would be shot down. David continued to make many trips to Lincoln to visit with and speak to influential people, not the least being Herb Scheimek. Head lobbyist for the Nebraska State Education Association. That was associated with the National Education Association. After a number of bills that friendly legislators had drafted were defeated, David was asked by CLA, Christian Law Association, to meet with Herb Scheimek. A new bill was drafted and was about ready for a vote. Now I'm going to read what David said in his own words. Christian Law Association called me one day and they said, "Hey Dave, why don't you just go and talk to Herb Scheimek?" Oh man, I don't want to talk to him. He's vicious. And he was. And so eventually I decided, okay, I will. So I went to him. I said, "Herb, I'd just like to talk to you." And he asked, "What do you want?" I said, "I just want to talk to you." And he said, "All right." So we met at 6 o'clock for breakfast in the restaurant in the Capitol. And we sat down. And he always just called me Berkey. Okay? "Berkey, what do you want?" Big, bold voice. He was so harsh. Oh, he didn't mince any words. And I said, "You know, Herb, we're not your enemy. And we're really not even a threat to you." And I went on to present my case. All we want is to be left alone so that we can practice our faith. "Herb, why? Why do you see me as such an enemy?" He wouldn't answer me. Finally, he said, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" And I said, "Herb, all I think you ought to do is just call the dogs off. Just take a walk when it's time for the next vote." He did, and the bill was passed. With this victory in hand, David went to talk to the governor, Bob Kerrey, whom he had befriended. On his way, the governor met him and said, "Well, David, we did it." We? This was a liberal Democratic governor who was elected, much to the dismay of the other church leaders and coalitions that were lobbying for the right to have their own schools. They had wrung their hands on his election, wondering, what are we going to do now? David had challenged them to consider that this is not limiting God's hand of deliverance. What if deliverance actually comes through this man, David said. He used wicked King Cyrus to restore his people to a good place. How old was David? 24 years old, but maybe 26 by now. This case had national repercussions. The Amish colony in southeast Nebraska sold out. They sold out and moved out, actually, partly on account of this issue. Faith Christians' fate was uncertain I think this lasted about 6 years total. Their fate was uncertain every year, but they quietly and slowly kept on. Well, all the time, David was making all these trips to the capital. There was a lot of attention given to this case, along with a good bit of tension and political polarization. When the continued court with Wayne Troyer came to pass, the judge eventually ruled the case as moot, because legislation was now in place that recognized the rights of parents to send children to private Christian schools. The case was dismissed, and that was great relief and much praising the Lord. There was actually several hearings that Wayne and his son actually sat in, and those were noteworthy on themselves too, but we're not going down that road this evening. A few noteworthy accounts that happened in all of this time. Ann Campbell was a commissioner of education. Now, I want you to consider the boldness of Brother Dave when he was so young like that, but convinced on where he stood. Ann Campbell was a commissioner of education. She was an in-charge type of lady, and David said he doesn't remember why he had the gall to do it, but she was sitting in a meeting on one side of the table while he was on the other side. In the course of conversation, she started beating on the table, saying, "I'm telling you, education is the answer for all the woes in our country." And I beat back on the table and I said, "I tell you, education will never answer the failures of the human heart. And that is the issue. That is why we need Christian schools." David recounted how there was a significant effort to try to get the conservatives to get out to vote. He says, "I remember sitting in a pastor's meeting with the governor where they were talking about getting out and getting the vote. They looked at me and said, 'Well, what are you going to do, David, with your people?' I mentioned that we had already been to the legislature, and then I said, our frame of mind is to go more by way of appeal like Daniel did than it would be to vote. And they said, 'You mean you don't vote?' I said, 'No, we do not.' 'Do you pay taxes, but you don't vote?' 'Yes, that's right.' You know, that was a new concept to them. Later on, you remember Herb Schimek? Things continued to simmer there. It didn't go down well with Herb that bill had passed. This was several years later. I saw in the paper that Herb Schimek had cancer. I told my wife I'm going to go down and visit Herb. I knew he didn't like me, but I went in anyway. When he saw who I was, he rolled over and turned his face to the wall. I walked up to the bed and I said to his back, "Herb, I'm here because I care. I want to know if it's okay if I have prayer with you." He was a Catholic. He said, "Yeah, go ahead." So I had prayer with him and left. Later, we were caroling down at the Omaha Mall one day. This was after we had come back to our original church. We were done when I heard somebody holler my name. And I'm like, oh my goodness, who knows me down here? That voice was familiar. It was Herb Schimek. He came and threw his big old arms around me. Now, Herb looks like he could have been a good fullback in football days. He was a big dude. He put his big old arms around me, and then he said, "I want you to meet my wife, Dave." I said, "Herb, but I haven't seen you for a long time. How are you doing?" My wife started going to a farmer's market down in Lincoln. Herb Schimek bought lots of angel food cakes from my wife. And she'd always come home and say, "Herb was there today, and he wanted to know how you, David, are doing." David says that he considered Herb Scheimek to be one of his best friends. David also had to deal with Ernie Chambers. Ernie Chambers, I'm just going to read it. I knew Ernie Chambers quite well. He was a unique character, a twin brother. His father was a Baptist preacher. His father was very heartbroken about Ernie's belligerence against God and the Bible. He was an atheist, an avowed atheist, a lawmaker, legislator, very liberal legislator in North Lincoln. He always claimed, we thought at one point he might actually help us because he was always for the downtrodden, but because of our Christian faith, he would rather argue with us about our faith. He always claimed to be an independent, and he would refer to the Republicans and the Democrats, and that was what he did routinely. He was a very intelligent and good student of the law. He took the bar exam, but refused to accept his bar license, and he was always against the system. I'm only reading you this so you'll understand a little bit of some kind of the opposition that he faced. So yeah, the answer is that I know quite a bit about Ernie. I interacted with him a lot. I had many discussions with him about things. He knew what we were about, and he totally disagreed with us. He would write poetry about us and read it as filibuster at times, and it could go for a long time while the bills were being discussed. His office decor was stuff that looked like Halloween. It was gruesome, and it was not nice to have to go up to his office. He was just a nonconformist in every way. He was a master at what he did. He did not become a certified lawyer because that would have meant that he had to be part of the Bar Association. So he took the bar exam, passed it with flying colors, but he refused to conform to society's norms. He could hold the whole legislature hostage by his tactics and his moves, and he knew every move. I saw recently that his term limits ran out, and he's running again as an 84-year-old, I think, running again for the Nebraska legislature. And he is a state senator. I was curious about this because I had read about this earlier, so I asked David if he met or knew Ernie Chambers because I had read this about him. Ernie Chambers, in 2007, sued God for widespread death, destruction, and terrorization of the millions of Earth's inhabitants. The case was cast out because there was no mailing address for the defendant. So I think I'll just stop right there. If you have any questions, anyone?
So the Nebraska case feels fairly recent.
It is.
Were there any other states that had similar situations, or was Nebraska kind of the one?
For that late in the history, yes. So there were the latest skirmish with education officials. That was in the 70s. There was hardly any other cases after that. But Nebraska was really a tough nut to crack. It was really, really a serious thing. And it went for a long time. And finally, through a lot of pressure, the state yielded, and partly because of the way the bills were drafted with David's help, the language that was written, things like that, appealed to the legislature. And so David Berkey gets a lot of the credit for the Nebraska freedom of education, as well as this case was followed substantially throughout the whole United States especially. And it led the way for opening the way for homeschooling and things like that. This was a case that was quite significant for those causes. It is interesting that a lot of the things that happen in the Midwest. The things that really were landmark were happening in the Midwest. You have Iowa, you have Nebraska, and you have Wisconsin. Yoder versus Wisconsin there. So a lot of those things were significant in that regard. And one of the things that is significant to me too is that how the Amish, especially, and the Anabaptists in general, led the way. They were the ones that were often at the forefront. A lot of these situations that that bring to us today the freedom we have. Let's remember the price that they paid. It was a significant price paid. Yes. Yes, I will. Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I had a conversation with Timothy Miller in Romania this week, and I asked him how things are going. He said, well, you know about the restrictions and the problems that we've been having about having homeschool not be legal and homeschooling not be legalized in Romania. And his concluding comment was, things have never looked better for Romania than now for homeschooling. And this is what has happened. So Andrei Gabor, he is a staff member at Christian Light Academy there in Romania. He's a staff member. He's on the admin team. He is a deacon in their church there, and he is also a legal scholar. Not quite an attorney, but pretty much one. And he and another lawyer, homeschooling dad, met with a minister of education and found him to be very sympathetic to their cause once they explained it from their point of view. He was very sympathetic to their cause, and prior to this time, everything was coming at it from a legal perspective. So what they arranged through their visits with the Minister of Education was that they will start working directly with his office from now on. Instead of working through the legal scholar, through the legal channels, they will start working directly with his office. And it turns out that the team of people that they met with, including the Minister of Education, actually asked Andrei and the people at Christian Light Academy in Romania, actually asked them to also help draft the language for laws that will be suitable for homeschooling in Romania. So, isn't that significant? So actually, this is probably going to show up on YouTube tonight, and partly because I requested it for their sake. They said, "Are you going to be talking about this kind of thing?" And I said, "Yes, I will." They said, "We want to see that, so we can be encouraged in our approach." They have weighed it, and they have decided that this is not necessarily a violation of separation of church and state, but we can actually be a light. We can actually do something with this opportunity. So we can pray for them, pray for the work in Romania in that regard. Okay, thank you for your interest in Anabaptist Christian education. Let's remember that these were just two accounts of, well, several more than that, but several accounts of the price that was paid for the privileges we have today.